Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns, we listen into a talk given at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin, hosted by the Strauss Center. The talk is given by Henry Hale, a professor of political science and international relations at George Washington University and a scholar of post-Soviet Eurasia. In his talk, Hale explains the evolution of power structures in post-Soviet Eurasia, focusing on the concept of patronalism, the idea that political power is distributed by and wielded by networks that are connected by personal acquaintance and led by a single powerful patron. It's a fascinating discussion, and Hale goes into how this formulation of patronalism can often lead to a cyclical cycle even when reform or revolution seems to have occurred. The talk is introduced by Jeremy Suri, a professor of history and professor at the LBJ School, and by Matthew Orr, a Brumley Fellow and graduate student at the LBJ School. Let's listen in.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our event today on democracy, autocracy, and revolution in Russia and post-Soviet Eurasia. This is one of those events that covers everything and brings a brilliant speaker to us to cover all the big events around this topic. I want to just begin by thanking the Strauss Center for sponsoring this event and the Brumley program. As you know, I'm Professor Jeremy Suri, and I have the great fortune of working with so many of our terrific students here at the University of Texas at Austin and through the Strauss Center. And it's my job today, my only job, to introduce one of my students, who's a Brumley Fellow, a very distinguished all-star graduate student, also just a delightful person to work with, a person of deep knowledge, but also a gregarious, optimistic, congenial personality. Better facial hair than my own also, Matthew Orr. Matt is a third-year graduate student in both the Global Policy Studies program at the LBJ School and in the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at UT. He's doing a dual degree master's. He received his BA in Russian language and literature from George Washington University, and our guest is from GW as well, so there's a little GW mafia going on here. And Matt's interests span issues from civic education to democratization and social change in Russia, Ukraine, and the Eurasian space. He focuses on history, literature, social science. He's worked in Russia for 3 years, which means he spent 3 winters in Russia. That was always the test for me as a historian. Could you spend 1 winter in Russia? I did that. That was enough. Matt is a true Russian, a true martyr. He spent 3 years in that space, 3 summers, and this included teaching English through a Fulbright program. Matt is fluent in Russian and Ukrainian. He's the co-host of a terrific podcast, student-run, that I recommend to all of you, called Slavic Connection, on all things Slavic and even some non-Slavic things. I also know that Matt is an expert on Belarus as well. He's been on my podcast, This is Democracy, to talk about some of the really important changes happening in Belarus, which don't get enough attention in the United States. And the last thing I'll say about Matt is, as part of his MA thesis and also his Brumley project, he's doing some really exciting, groundbreaking work on civic education in Russia and Ukraine, comparing and showing how in some ways Ukraine has done a little better in civic education and how that has contributed perhaps to some better democratic outcomes, or progress at least, in Ukraine. But without further ado, let me just turn it over to Matt. Matt, thank you for organizing this event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suri, for that wonderful introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker today, which is Dr. Henry Hale. Dr. Hale is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, my alma mater. His publications have won 2 prizes from the American Political Science Association, and he currently serves as the chair of the editorial board of Demokratizatsiya, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization. Dr. Hale is also the co-director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, PONAR's Eurasia. He is the author, among other articles and books, of Patronal Politics, Eurasian Regime Dynamics in Comparative Perspective from 2015, and co-editor of the textbook Developments in Russian Politics 9 from 2019. He has spent extensive time conducting field research in post-Soviet Eurasia and is currently working on identity politics and political system change, with a special focus on how public opinion dynamics in Russia and Ukraine are shaping those countries. I think that the public is well exposed to the opinions of policymakers, former diplomats, officials, and so on, as to why democracy finds itself in such a difficult position in Russia and post-Soviet Eurasia. But I think it's much rarer that we get to hear an academic perspective, maybe from those who are able to step back and engage these issues in a more scholarly way to help us understand democracy's struggles in Russia and the region, and maybe what we could do to better support it. With that, I'd like to thank Dr. Hale for being with us today. I think it'll be a real treat, and I'll turn it over to him. Dr. Hale, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Jeremy. And more generally, thanks to the Strauss Center and the Brumley Program for the invitation to talk with you today. I'm just going to share my screen here. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about how I see political regime dynamics, if you want to call them that, playing out in Russia and the post-Soviet world, which basically means focusing on patterns of democracy, the lack thereof, authoritarianism, when these systems break down, and how we can understand the politics there, which I think will also have important implications for how we understand what Russia does in international relations, not just what Kremlin or Putin does in his domestic politics. So we'll start out by just giving you the puzzle that I see of post-Soviet politics generally, which is summarized by the great diversity of regime types in this part of the world. And when I talk about Eurasia, I'm following a usage that basically refers to the post-Soviet countries as Eurasia, although there are other ways of thinking about Eurasia that include, everything from Europe to Asia. What's interesting is coming out of a single political regime, the Soviet Union, you see everything from the Baltic countries, which are now embedded in the European Union, fairly stably democratic, to Turkmenistan, where, at least for a long time, you literally had a golden statue of the dictator rotating to face the sun. And then you have lots of other regimes that are sort of in between. Some like Russia, closer to the very authoritarian end, others like Ukraine, a little closer to the democratic end, but none of them really fitting kind of pure types of autocracy or democracy. And thinking back to how we as observers of the Soviet Union and then Russia and Ukraine and these other countries have thought about these regimes, it seems to me that we've been on something like a roller coaster ride of expectations regarding where these countries are headed. After 1991, people were even talking about concepts like the end of history. Liberalism has won. It's just a matter of time before these countries consolidate democracy. But then it wasn't too long after that people started to think, well, wait a minute, things aren't really heading in that direction very well. A lot of the countries are almost as authoritarian, again, as the Soviet Union used to be. Some of them getting more autocratic. Certainly with the rise of Putin, that became the dominant trend. Then you had a series of revolutions in these places that seemed to be inspired by democracy. The Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, all of which then got people talking about, well, okay, there's a new march towards democracy, and these authoritarian regimes of the region are losing, and now we're back moving in the direction of democracy, at least generally. But then those regimes, those post-revolutionary systems did not fare so well. Almost all of them went back, at least some degree, towards a more authoritarian system. And so it seems like we've been much better at kind of explaining things that have happened in the past than at anticipating what's going to happen in the future. Of course, that's not surprising generally, but we want to see if we can move a little bit further away from chasing trends to explaining them and anticipating developments in a way that can account for more than just what we're looking at a particular given period of time, and try to get a big picture of what's going on in that part of the world. Just to preview the basic argument that I will present, to understand what's going on in this part of the world, we have to understand its kind of socio-cultural context, which I've called patronalism, and I will talk about what that is in a moment. And the argument is that given this context, there's a strong tendency for regime dynamics to be cyclical, to kind of move back and forth towards and away from democracy. These cycles can be kind of irregular and irregular, meaning that sometimes countries can kind of be in one phase of a cycle for quite a long time, but there still is likely to be a tendency for a kind of reverse movement. But then since 1991, the trend has actually been towards more and more predictability in where these regimes are going. So, and then I'll conclude with some implications for how we might understand major countries like Russia and Ukraine, kind of where they're headed and how they might be expected to behave in both domestic politics and international politics. So what do I mean by patronalism? So for lack of a better word, so I kind of took this word and infused it with this meaning. What I'm really talking about is a society where connections matter, and not just a society where connections matter for politics, like a little bit, right? Like I'm in Washington, D.C. We all know connections matter, kind of who you know, but societies where they are almost all determining. So patronalism is a social equilibrium, meaning that it's self-reinforcing, in which the pursuit of political or economic ends, so the way that people go about achieving things in politics or economics, tends to be organized primarily through personalized rewards and punishments, meted out to specific individuals through networks of actual acquaintance. And so this is basically the idea that you are working to get something done, like organizing a political party or movement or to change a policy. You don't just organize with like-minded individuals. More likely than not, you will organize with individuals that you know or have some connection with. Maybe it's not your own friend or your own relative, but it's a friend of your friend or a relative of your friend or a friend of your relative, and so on and so on and so on. Because these connections are really important for knowing who you can trust. And so, there's an argument to be made that this is a natural way for people to get things done in government. The earliest human societies were very small. And so, of course, you're going to know everybody in that society. So it makes sense to work through the personal relationships that you have. It's only once society got very large and you started to have like communities that were much bigger, then it was possible for everyone to know each other in, that the idea of kind of working through sort of impersonal rules, would emerge. But in fact, I think you can make the argument that it's actually unusual in the world practice for institutions to work independently of personal connections. And even as we know in the United States or, other countries that we think about as being very rule of law based, it wasn't that long in our histories where, where those systems of rule of law were sort of questionable or could be broken down easily by corrupt practices or who you know. And even that is sort of a relatively recent practice. And so the point that I want to make here is that patronalism is a kind of vicious cycle. And that's what I mean kind of by an equilibrium. It's being self-reinforcing, in that most of the people generally oppose the idea of it in the abstract, right? So the idea of kind of having to pull a connection, right? Call in a connection to get something like a job or a good that's, scarce. People don't like that idea. You don't like the idea that, why should the, relatives of the doctor get an appointment sooner than I get an appointment, even though my medical need is more acute, right? People don't like that idea. But at the same time, people also take advantage of it when it benefits them or when they think it's necessary. And they're arguably more likely to take advantage of it and use these practices if they think that other people are doing so. So if you think this is how things are done, right, that's, you don't like it, but this is how things work in my country, it becomes more acceptable to say, okay, well, in an ideal world, I wouldn't do this, but, I have no other choice. I need to get, this appointment for my son, or I need to, I need this kind of rare or scarce good for, some purpose. I really need a job, or my brother needs a job. So I'm going to pull on these connections to see if I can get them something. And so in this sense, what you do in deciding whether or not to kind of pull your connections, right, to draw on your connections to get something done, depends on what you expect other people to do. So if you expect a lot of other people to be doing this, it becomes more acceptable for you to be doing it. And when everybody expects everyone else to do it, it can become extremely hard to root out. Because to root it out, you need to convince people not only that you shouldn't do it, that it's a bad thing, but that other people aren't doing it either. So what are some of the rough correlates of patronalism? These are more familiar concepts like high levels of corruption, low rule of law. There are other kind of political science terms that some of you might recognize: low social capital, clientelism, that kind of thing. I want to make clear that patronalism is not the same as corruption. A lot of people would characterize lobbying in the United States as corrupt, even though it's not corrupt in the sense of violating law, right? Because it's legal. So there is a distinction here, but it's simply the idea of kind of working through connections. And the other thing I'd mention is there can also be a certain morality to working through connections, right? Because if you are say a legislator that needs to get something done that's vital for your community that you represent, say like, getting a medical center built in your community, and you refuse to draw on your personal connections, and if that means that everybody else who is drawing on their personal connections are going to get the things that your community needs, then there's an argument that a lot of people in your community are going to make that you are ineffective. You are not able to serve us and represent us, given what everybody else does, given just the way things are. And so in that case, you can make an argument that the legislature who engages in such practices, would be doing so by necessity, that they, think that, well, this is not the ideal world. This is the least of the evil options that are available to me. So we can see kind of certain patterns in the post-Soviet world where, levels of patronalism are higher. And so, I already mentioned kind of the Baltic countries, that are in the middle category of moderately patronalistic. The least patronalistic would be in the post-communist world, certain East European countries, Croatia, Czech Republic, East Germany, but you can see among the more patronalistic countries would be, countries ranging from, alphabetically Albania, down to Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, to Russia and Ukraine, most of the post-Soviet space. And, these are categorizations based on a related concept, not the same thing, but basically I think they kind of, fit. Just to give you an idea of where patronalism, I think, is kind of in strong form there, and therefore likely, it's important for us to understand how it works in order to understand its politics. So what are some of the implications for politics? So I'm going to talk in the abstract a little bit before then talking about how a lot of this applies to former Soviet patterns, including in Russia and Ukraine. So one implication is that the most important collective political actors in these societies tend to be extended networks of actual personal acquaintance. So that means they are not institutions that we usually think of in the United States as being the main actors in politics, like parties, parliament, or Congress, the government, the state, or even firms, or even individuals. Instead, these are actual networks that tend to be relatively hierarchical, where you have one person at the top that may be considered a patron, that then kind of actually have their own representatives in all of these other formal institutions. So the more powerful networks in places like Russia will have representatives in multiple political parties, often completely different ideologies. So some might have a representative or be donating money at the same time to the Communist Party and to a pro-democracy party. They might also have representatives in parliament, in the executive branch, have firms or economic enterprises under their control, right? So they operate across these formal institutions, and they can mobilize all of these different resources in battle against other networks that have similar structures, but just have somewhat different interests. And they tend to be roughly hierarchical, as I said before, kind of extending from the top to the bottom. So if we look at the post-Soviet space, what kind of networks are there? Well, first of all, they're networks that often get called in the media oligarchs, right? These are typically networks where the people at the top, the chief patrons, are some of the richest business people in the world. And so, but these business people are more than just business people, right? They're more than their formal title of, CEO of Alpha Group, for example, or, Gunvor, or, to give some examples of corporations in Russia, right? Instead, what they are is they're not only the head of this corporation, but they also have all these networks of all kinds of personal, people who basically owe them something or who can be called on to help out, that penetrate all these different other organizations, including parties, parliament, regional governments, and so on. Regional political machines are also another form of network, basically local interests, where you have a local, strongman, woman, warlord type person that dominates a local territory, kind of all the, assets, economic, political, nonprofit, so to speak, in a given region. That's another type of network. In some parts of the former Soviet space, there's talk of like clans. They don't really boil down to just kinship, but kinship, family ties can be part of that. And also networks that kind of grow out of the state. So just to give you a example, and so this is an example from the 1990s, which is useful primarily because you can really document what it, basically, all these different ties and the types of people that are in it, which are often kind of difficult to actually tease out. So if we look at Moscow Mayor Yuri Luzhkov's political network from 1998 to 1999, we see his power was not simply being mayor of Moscow and therefore having the powers that were ascribed to him in the city charter. Instead, the power that he had to influence national politics grew on a whole array of different personal connections. So for one thing, he had strong alliances with big businesses that had made a lot of money by working with him in the Moscow's mayor office, and also sometimes with relationships dating before he became mayor. So the Most network, Media Most and everything included media and had lots of business holdings across Russia. His wife, Baturina, was one of the richest women in Russia, and she had a whole construction enterprise that she ran that had businesses all across Russia. So she had business partners, employees, clients, lots of other businesses that were in relationship with Luzhkov. Of course, he did also have the people within the Moscow city administration, which had all kinds of economic interests, owned shares in a lot of the businesses doing business in Russia, controlled media. There was a nationwide television network that was largely owned and controlled by the Moscow city government. There were people that Luzhkov or his associates went to school with or had deep, longstanding friendships with that also had major assets. And so basically there were all kinds of different people that could be drawn on to use their assets, their money, their wealth, their power to help Luzhkov when he called on them to do so. And so these were people that were actually mobilized when he decided to run for president in 1988 and 1999. And ultimately he was defeated by Putin, but then co-opted by Putin, who then basically took over to a large extent his network. So this is just by way of an example. So let me get on to a couple other implications here. So networks like Luzhkov's and many, many others find that they need direct and personal access to power in order to survive and thrive, to make their money, to exercise their power. And this is largely because they can't rely on courts or the rule of law to protect them if they lose power. So if they fall into opposition against the person who is dominant, then they risk losing everything. And so what they try to do is basically, the second thing mentioned here is to be on the winning side whenever there's a struggle for power at the top. And so what we saw Luzhkov do was initially he was running for power, but then at a certain point, he wanted to be president in 1999, which is when Putin was trying to become president. But at a certain point, it became clear that Putin was going to win. And at that point, you saw Luzhkov basically take his pedal off the gas and start trying to make amends with Putin and to support him. And that's one reason why Putin, in the end, won the presidential election with a big margin, was because the people who had opposed him had already given up once they had seen that Putin was the stronger political candidate. And so these people like Luzhkov realized that they didn't want to lose their assets. Instead, they thought they'd be better off by aligning with Putin. And so this helped them survive politically for a lot longer. So in the end, Luzhkov wound up an integral part of Putin's political system until 2010, when he was finally removed. And at that point, basically, he suffered the political consequences of what he had done. But he bought himself another 10 years by trying to get himself on the winning side, regardless of all of the reasons that he had given earlier to be against the Russian authorities and the people that had backed, Putin's rise to power. And so, the key is, if you stand a risk of losing everything, if you're on the losing side, it becomes more important to be on the winning side than to stand up for what you actually believe in. So it doesn't mean you don't actually have any beliefs, but it just means that you're much more likely to kind of push those aside for the purposes of not falling into disfavor with the authorities. And so there's a big push to, basically kind of figure out who is going to win and then get on their side. And the final couple implications that I'll mention are, first of all, because each network has resources that can influence who wins a power struggle, the side that ultimately wins any struggle for power depends on which side all of these networks together support, right? So, say you have 10 very powerful networks in Russia. Each one might have a tenth of the power to decide who is going to be the next president of Russia, or who is going to be able to continue to be the president of Russia. So if 6 of them get together and say, okay, well, we're going to support candidate X, that's great. But for each network individually, one of them could say, okay, well, I don't want to be one of the 6 because I don't like this candidate. I want to gang up with the other 4 and push another candidate. So then that'll create a deadlock. And then all they have to do is bring one more candidate over, or one more network over, to tip the balance. And so effectively what this means is that there's a key politics of coordination among these networks, because the power of the patron, right, is vulnerable to all of these different power networks. But every each power network acting individually is not strong enough to make the decision, but together they can. And so the key is, how do these networks decide on whose authority to recognize and whose authority to back? Because which side you back depends on what side you think the others are backing, but what side the others are backing depends in part on what side they think you are backing. So that's what a lot of politics in this part of the world, I think, is about, is figuring out where power, not just where power lies now, but where it's likely to lie in the future, and what other people are going to think about where it's likely to lie in the future, and then getting on that side, or influencing where those expectations lie. So one proposition that I put forth here is that in a situation like this, having a constitution that posits a single president as the most powerful actor in a country is going to tend to lead all of these networks to coordinate their authority around that single patron. And so basically, if you imagine a simple patronalistic world where you have lots of these different networks, a bunch of oligarchs, regional political machines, and no constitution, they're all kind of competing for power, being careful to try to figure out who's going to be the most powerful. So they're looking for signs of how powerful all the others are. And there's no prior constitution. If you introduce a presidentialist constitution on top of that, then effectively what this is doing is creating an indivisible good, meaning the office of the presidency, that symbolizes superior strength, right? But that only one network can hold. So by introducing a constitution that says there's a post of the president, this person is the most powerful, Well, this is going to have a couple effects, because whoever gets that presidency is going to be more likely to be seen by others as the more powerful, just by virtue of having had enough power to get the presidency. And then this in turn will make other networks more likely to see you as the more dominant person, and therefore to act in your interests, or at least not contradict your interests. And the presidency could also basically make its occupant, as I mentioned here, a focal point for anyone who's uncertain. So, right, say you don't know, okay, well, there are these two networks in the country, they're both powerful, but I don't really know which one is more powerful. Well, one of them has this title of president and the other doesn't. So maybe I'll just go over to the president, because I think maybe that's just the better option here. And so kind of what this is saying is that the Constitution and having a presidency can influence how these networks behave, even if these networks don't care at all about the rule of law. All they care about is who holds the symbolism of power, and that is going to lead them to coordinate around that person. And so what this would lead you to expect is that, like, we go back to these representations of the networks, that the people in the non-presidential network are going to be more likely to start recognizing the network that has control of the presidency. And so you're going to get a situation where a lot of different networks are now kind of arranging themselves around the one that has the presidency and marginalizing anyone who doesn't do that. And so this is a situation that I've called a single pyramid system that is going to look quite authoritarian, because who's going to provide money to opposition politicians if all the people who control the money and the power locally in different businesses are just trying to please the president? So, even without laws kind of stating that the country is authoritarian, you're going to see this consolidation of power around the president. And so I think if we now start thinking about what's happened in the post-Soviet space since the Soviet Union collapsed, basically the 1990s is a history of single pyramid systems like this emerging in the former Soviet Union. And so, basically the Soviet Union collapsed. It left all these different collections of people together, all kinds of different networks, some of whom were kind of newly created in the transition through the opportunities they saw. Others kind of had their roots in the Soviet period. And kind of the whole system had disappeared. And what we see is that all 12 of the high patronalism post-Soviet states, former Soviet Union states, wound up with presidentialist constitutions. And all but one of them wound up developing this kind of strong patronal presidentialism, single pyramid systems, through all kinds of political struggles that turned out in the 1990s. And there's only one exception out of these 12 states where you didn't wind up with a kind of authoritarian system that was dominated by the president, and that was in Moldova, where, for a variety of reasons, a parliamentary system basically won out. The parliament won the struggle with the president, and then it took a totally different regime path. One thing to remember, though, is that even once this, the president consolidates power, the expectations of a leader's departure, so succession struggles basically can be, a cause of the instability of this system, right? So a president manages to get a hold of the presidency, rallies all these other networks in society around it, which then support his or her power and dominance over the rest of society. It would seem like this would be a pretty permanent system. But what we also see is that when people start thinking that, well, maybe there's going to be a succession on the horizon, maybe this leader is going to be on his or her way out, the whole system starts to fall apart because the leader effectively becomes a lame duck, right? So networks in the system, when they think the leader is going to be on the way out, have to position themselves for a future after the outgoing president. And this means they have to start jockeying now to identify who's going to be this person, who the likeliest winner is. And where possible, they might want to become the winner, or at least make sure their rival is not the winner, right? To influence who becomes the winner. And this kind of competition which then reduces the authority of the sitting president, can start to break apart this single pyramid system. And so a typical result can be what happens is a revolutionary process whereby the regime breaks apart. You get open competition now among these networks. They start competing for public opinion as a way of influencing the outcomes of these struggles. But it's not really democratization, even though the people that have support often wind up being the winners. And the people who have public support in these struggles often win because they can get the most people in the streets. And a lot of times these other networks kind of look and say, okay, well, in case the election is free or fair, the people that have more support at a minimum have an advantage. And if it's not going to be free and fair, the people who have more support aren't going to have to engage in as much pressure to falsify results, engage in all kinds of riskier activity. But the problem is that after the struggle is resolved, you get this whole dynamic taking place again, whereby the networks coordinate again around a new president. And you get basically a new single pyramid system emerging. And so we see that basically after the original single pyramid system formed in every political system in the post-Soviet space, regime cycles have become pretty regular. And so if we look at again, depending on how you count them, basically 9 patronal presidents, networks have been ousted in various kinds of revolutions or palace coups in the former Soviet space since the 1990s, since the first single pyramid systems were introduced. And 8 of these 9 were overthrown when they encountered a situation where they were unpopular and so we're not able to keep up public support and were essentially lame ducks for one of the following reasons. Either they had reached term limits, which they had not removed from the books. So you can see a lot of the leaders here, Bakiev, Akayev in Kyrgyzstan, Lev Petrosyan in Armenia, Shevardnadze in Georgia, Saakashvili in Georgia, then more recently, Sargsyan in Armenia. They all ran up against term limits. Leonid Kuchma in Ukraine did not run. And Shevardnadze also had the issue that he was kind of over 70, which tends to raise expectations about succession. The big exception here was Ukraine in 2014, where Yanukovych was not up against term limits. He was unpopular, but he didn't combine the term limits with lack of popularity. And we also see cases where there were certain lame duck presidents who fell into political competition, but were still popular in support. And so these leaders managed to still win the succession struggles. And so this is where Vladimir Putin comes in. And we see Haydar Aliyev and Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan. And again, leaders of Armenia, without going into all the details. But in all of these cases, basically, even after revolutions like the Orange Revolution that were considered democratic breakthroughs, you saw a new round of political closure, except under one important condition. And the condition basically is that you had a constitutional change. And so the revolutions that kind of had a much more lasting democratic experience were the countries where the constitution switched with the revolution from a presidentialist system to one that had more of a system of checks and balances, what I've called the divided executive constitution, where basically you have a division of power wherein you have a prime minister that is primarily selected by parliament through parliamentary elections and a directly elected president. So basically they can check each other and prevent each other from consolidating power. I'm going to kind of skip the kind of logic behind this. I think it's basically intuitive here. But what we see is that then the countries that wound up with divided executive constitutions, those more checks and balances in the former Soviet space, have all wound up being much more open and democratic and competitive than the ones that have some form of presidentialism. So this is Ukraine, Georgia. Ukraine, again, it had a period where it had a presidentialist constitution. Moldova today and Kyrgyzstan up until maybe this spring when it looks like it's going to go back to a presidentialist constitution. And you can also point to some other post-communist cases in the greater post-communist region. And all these countries have been substantially more open. Yeah, so unlike presidentialism, they've managed to sustain their political activity. So Ukraine can be seen as a kind of classic patronal democracy in this regard. So it has a divided executive constitution, which it had between 2005 and 2010, and then again after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. And basically during these periods, the main networks have failed to dominate. And so when I say two networks failed to dominate, I'm referring to the current period. So you have pictured here Poroshenko, the previous president, and Zelensky, the current president, both of whom represented major political networks, including Poroshenko was himself an oligarch who had all kinds of representation and political power outside the presidency to potentially draw on. And Zelensky was widely interpreted as being backed by another oligarch in Ukraine, Ihor Kolomoisky, who was a big rival to Poroshenko. And so both of these presidents had strong network ties that came to dominance. And at least, Zelensky hasn't been in power for too long. Poroshenko was there for 5 years. And it's clear he tried to consolidate his control over the Ukrainian political system, but was simply unable to do it because the constitution doesn't really provide the same incentives for all of these diverse networks in Ukraine to coordinate their authority around those of Poroshenko. And so the result is that you get basically a form of democracy, but one that's very, you might call it corrupt and weak. It's kind of like a competition among different political machines. So there's very little fraud, right? Very little outright falsification of vote results. But what there is a lot of corruption in the political system, lots of payoffs, media stories being planted, rumors of vote buying, which I think probably are credible in a lot of circumstances. Politicians kind of unduly influencing each other, or trying to tip the scales electorally using kind of corrupt means. But there's still competition. There's still relatively strong opportunities for opposition to mobilize and actually win. So we saw that Zelensky actually defeated Poroshenko in the 2019 presidential elections. And now Zelensky, even though he's leading the presidential race, he's far from dominant. And so we see just a much more fluid kind of political system there. Whereas in Russia, it's much more of a good example of a single pyramid system, which I think gives it this aura of being a stably authoritarian country. And so how has this managed to be the case in Russia? In the 1990s, Russia looked a lot like Ukraine and even the early Putin era. So how did we get there in Russia? Well, I already talked about the process through which presidential constitution helped consolidate networks coordination around the single patron. In this case, the patron is Putin. So in this sense, the system is, I think the system is not really adequately called Putinism because it exists in lots of other places. And Putin certainly did not invent this system of rule. It existed in other places like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan long before Putin came in place. And even if you look at kind of some of the politics in Russia's regions, something like this existed in Russia long before Putin entered the political scene in 1999 and 2000. But what Putin has done, and what I think is fairly distinctive about him as a chief patron, is that he has been very, very good at doing the things that require keeping this kind of system stable and functioning, which is, first of all, to find ways to sustain popular support, or at a minimum, the belief that he's popular. I think there's good reason to believe he actually is popular. It doesn't mean he would be popular if there were a lot of free media criticism of him available, but he maintains this popular support through control over the media by actually paying attention to some kinds of policies and outputs. So they have an interest in promoting economic growth to some degree. The government does a lot of things that it thinks people will like and avoids a lot of things it doesn't think they'll like. and also generating rally around the flag effects. And I think this is where actions like, the invasion of Crimea come in. I don't think it was only about domestic politics, but at least it had this effect of boosting his popular support. Putin has also most recently, in the 2020 constitutional reform, eliminated term limits that were also potentially, creating succession problems in Russia. And he also displays a great deal of skill in arranging all the complex networks in his system. So finding places for the old Yeltsin era networks, like the old ones like, Luzhkov's group and the Alpha group. I mean, Luzhkov's group basically found them a place until he decided he finally wanted to kind of push them out 10 years later. New networks that have arisen in the Putin era, basically among his childhood friends or people that he knew from earlier stages in life who became massively wealthy and connected in politics, and also his own family, right? So it's very interesting that Putin has paid great attention to keeping his family out of politics, because I think actually one's relatives can become a political liability in systems like this. There are a few exceptions where people have made it work, like in Azerbaijan, but for the most part, it's been a problem. But one thing that Russia can't control, which I think is weakening this system, the Kremlin can't control, is the health of the age of the leader, because once the leader starts getting older, less firm, succession rumors are going to start, right? Rumors are going to start. Why wasn't he seen in public the last 3 days? Oh, maybe he has this disease. Oh my God, he might have a disease. Maybe it's fatal. And these kind of things can create, big tensions in the system. So just to conclude with some possible implications for the future, I think for Russia, one implication is Russia is less stable than it's often thought. At least the current political system. And the key, I think, is Putin's health, which means that, as Putin ages, every successive election is likely to be more and more dangerous for the Kremlin's ability to keep the reins of power. And this is going to give Putin increasingly intense incentive to try and find ways to reconnect with the population, which is a big challenge because Russia's growth has been fairly anemic in recent times. And, the COVID crisis has certainly been a big problem in that regard. And I think this is one reason why we might expect some more surprises in Russian foreign policy, just moves that might gin up public support for him. In the meantime, without these kind of new injections of popular support that they would try to provide, we see the Kremlin increasingly relying on authoritarian methods, crackdowns, jailing political opponents in ways they really haven't done before, or at least on a scale that they haven't done before. Ukraine, on the other hand, actually, I think has some promise. I mean, the biggest challenge, of course, is the war with Russia, which I think sets off domestically some very negative dynamics that hinder democratization. But it's interesting to me, kind of looking at what's been going on in Ukraine, that Zelensky seems to be actually showing evidence that he might be actually going after his own patron, Kolomoisky, which I've always seen as a idea that he may, as kind of a sign, right, that, if he really wants to democratize, he's going to be going out. He has to go after people who supported him, not just his political opponents. And so this may be the case. But one of the big problems with a system like this, and this will be my final remark, is that unfortunately, because patronal democracy tends to be kind of corrupt competition, people often don't like it because they don't see it as real competition. They don't like the corruption in it. And a lot of times, ironically, this can lead people to say, well, actually, I don't like this corrupt competition. I actually would prefer kind of a strong man or strong woman type of system where we have a presidentialist system and we have order. I mean, the irony is, of course, that those systems are incredibly corrupt too. It's just you don't hear about it as much in media, and they seem more stable on the outside. But at the same time, they're more present towards revolution.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.